The phone rang as I washed the coffee mug, the one I've used every morning since the house became too quiet. I thought about ignoring it, as I do with almost all calls, but something about that unknown number made me answer. Maybe it was boredom, maybe it was custom. I never imagined that this simple gesture would break the feeling of normality that I had been maintaining with so much effort. The voice on the other end was polite, neutral, trained not to show emotion. He said the name of the bank, confirmed my details and asked if I was in a safe place to talk. That question seemed exaggerated to me. I was in my own kitchen, in my slippers, with the window open and the day was absolutely ordinary. He started by talking about recent updates to my account. He used technical terms, exact values, specific dates. At first, I listened with the distant attention of someone who trusts that everything is in order. I always took care of my finances rigorously, even when everyone insisted that I no longer had to worry about it. Then he mentioned a recent authorization. He said that I had approved important changes in investments and changed beneficiaries. I was silent for a few seconds, waiting for my memory to follow those words. He did not follow. I didn't remember any of it, and it felt like trying to remember a dream that slips away as soon as we wake up. I explained, with the calmness I learned to use when I was treated as someone confused, that there must be a mistake. I asked to repeat it. He repeated, with even more details. Dates from the previous week. Digital signatures. Decisions too big to be forgotten. My stomach contracted in a way I knew well. When I asked him who had requested those changes from me, he paused shortly, barely noticeably. Then I said a name that went through me like a clean cut. My own son's name. There was no dramatization, no suspense. Only the cold observation, said as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I felt my body heat up and, at the same time, a chill rise up my back. I spent years hearing that I was getting fragile, that it was better to leave certain decisions with those who understood more. Still, no one ever told me they were deciding for me, much less without warning me. I asked the attendant if there was any recording of my authorization. He said yes. That everything was documented. That seemed to be all in perfect order. That sentence hurt me more than any accusation. Because order, I always kept it. What was wrong was something else, something much deeper. As he spoke, I watched the kitchen around me. The old furniture, the table with one chair less, the clock marking the same time as always. Everything was in place. Except me. For the first time in a long time, I felt that my life was being lived by other hands. When I hung up, I stood still, with the phone still in my hand. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just knew, with painful clarity, that this call had not been a warning. It had been the beginning. Something had been done behind my back, and nothing would ever be the same again. The fact that you have chosen to stay here and hear this story so far says a lot about your sensitivity. What follows isn't just personal, it's a truth that quietly touches many people's lives. If you believe that stories like this need to continue to be told, subscribe to the channel, because this support is what keeps these truths alive. I spent the rest of the morning trying to return normality to the simplest gestures. I dried the mug, put it in the cupboard, cleaned the sink already clean. I repeated to myself that it could only be a mistake. Banks make mistakes. Systems fail. People confuse names. I had to believe that, because the alternative was too heavy to face right away. I called the bank again a few hours later, my voice trained to sound firm. I asked to speak to another attendant, as if changing the person could change reality. I repeated the story, I heard the same confirmations. Dates, values, digital records. Everything was very organized, very correct. The coldness of the information contrasted with the growing tightness in my chest. As he spoke, I began to remember small conversations from the past. Comments thrown in the air, suggestions disguised as concern. Let me sort it out for you. These things are too complicated. I always thought it was careful. Now, these memories came back with a strange, almost accusatory weight. I hung up again without new answers. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wooden top, marked by time. That table had seen birthdays, discussions, farewells. I never thought I would also witness the moment when I began to doubt my own family. I took an old folder of documents, one of those we keep out of habit, not out of immediate need. I started leafing through contracts, statements, bank letters. Everything seemed normal at first glance. That was precisely what worried me. Nothing screamed error. Nothing seemed out of place. It was as if the betrayal was hidden in full light. What hurt the most was not the money. He always knew how to live with less. What hurt was the feeling of having been put aside, treated as someone incapable of deciding their own future. Me, who spent decades solving problems, raising children, supporting an entire house. In the late afternoon, my son called. The quiet voice, the casual tone. He talked about banal things, as if the world hadn't changed a few hours earlier. I almost told everything right there, I almost asked for explanations. But something held me back. A quiet intuition told me that I needed to understand more before I could speak. After we hung up, I felt a different, denser loneliness. It was not physical absence. It was the realization that maybe I had never really been seen. Perhaps it had always been just the frail figure they found convenient to see. At night, lying in bed, sleep did not come. My mind repeated the same phrase, "It must be a mistake." But it no longer sounded like a certainty. It sounded like a request. A last-ditch effort to protect something I wasn't ready to lose yet. It was there, in the dark of the room, that I first accepted the possibility that no one had made a mistake. That everything had been done exactly as planned. And that, if I wanted answers, I would have to look for them alone. The next day, I woke up with the feeling that something was out of place, even before I opened my eyes. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was a silent restlessness, as if my body knew before me that this doubt would not go away on its own. I prepared the coffee slowly, trying to keep the routine intact, as if it could protect me from what I didn't want to face yet. I decided to call the bank again, this time asking for complete access to the records. I did not speak of error, nor of confusion. I asked for information, objectively, the way I always did when I needed to be taken seriously. The attendant was polite, but the tone carried that disguised condescension that I learned to recognize over time. She read the data aloud, with excessive care. Dates, values, digital signatures. When he arrived at the field of authorized representatives, there was a brief pause. I already knew what was coming, but even so my heart raced. Hearing my son's name, officially associated with my financial decisions, was different from hearing it on the previous call. This time, it sounded definitive. I asked since when it had been in force. The answer came too quickly. Months. Maybe more. Enough time for choices to be made, planned, executed without me knowing. Enough time for my absence to be normalized. I hung up and sat for a few minutes, looking at my own hands. They were marked, firm hands, hands that worked, cared for, sustained. They didn't match the fragile image they apparently had of me. For the first time, I felt anger mixed with sadness. I remembered the times he insisted on helping me with papers, the conversations in which he spoke too slowly, as if I didn't keep up. I always gave in, more out of fatigue than incapacity. Now he realized that each concession had made room for something greater. What hurt me the most was understanding that it had not been done in a hurry. It was not an impulse, nor an emergency. It was method. It was the certainty that I would not question it, that I would accept. Maybe I would even thank you. I thought about calling him at that moment, demanding explanations, raising my voice. But something in me has changed. For the first time, he did not want to react. I wanted to observe. I wanted to understand how far that betrayal went before showing that I had woken up. I spent the afternoon reviewing old files on the computer. I found emails that I did not remember receiving, messages answered on my behalf, decisions communicated as if they were consensual. Each discovery was a small blow, but also a confirmation. When night fell, I had no doubts. The name that should not be there did not appear by chance. It was placed with intention. And in that heavy silence of the house, I understood that the relationship between us had changed forever, even if he didn't know it yet. The next morning, I realized that something in me had hardened. It wasn't coldness, it was lucidity. I spent years believing that giving in avoided conflict, that accepting help was a sign of maturity. Now I was beginning to understand that, for some, my agreement had always been interpreted as a convenient weakness. I remembered the last time he was here. He sat down at the table, fiddled with the papers without asking permission, and commented, almost laughing, that certain things were already too complicated for me. I smiled that day. An automatic smile, one of those we use to not seem too sensitive. Today, that smile seemed to me like a silent authorization. Whenever I asked questions, the answers came too simplified, as if I were incapable of understanding nuances. When he insisted, the patient, almost didactic tone came. I mistook that for care. Only now did I realize how much I was being diminished little by little, sentence by sentence, gesture by gesture. I started to observe old memories with another look. The decisions made without me, the conversations ended prematurely, the documents already resolved. Everything fit together in an uncomfortable way. It was not forgetfulness. It was exclusion carefully disguised as protection. What hurt me most was knowing that this fragile image had not come out of nowhere. It was built, fed whenever I kept silent, whenever I accepted not being heard. I helped create the version of me that they were now using against me. That day, I received a message from him asking if I was okay. I said yes. Just one word. Short, dry. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain anything. The explanation, I realized, was always required only of me. I went out for a walk in the late afternoon. The cold air helped organize my thoughts. I saw other women my age, some with slow steps, others decisive. I thought about how many of us are treated as invisible or incapable simply because we have aged. On my way home, I sat down in front of the mirror in the hallway. I watched my face carefully, the marks of time, the tired but attentive eyes. That woman there was not fragile. I was hurt, yes. But wound is not the same as broken. I understood, then, that the problem was never my age, nor my memory, nor my ability. The problem was that they allowed them to speak for me for too long. And now that I had realized this, nothing would make me pretend again. That night, I slept little, but I slept differently. Not afraid of what would come, but with the certainty that I would no longer be just a spectator of my own life. Something had changed, and there was no turning back. That morning, I didn't turn on the radio or television. I needed silence to listen to my own thoughts, something I had been avoiding for too long. I sat at the table with the open folder in front of me and decided that this time I would not leaf through anything out of habit. I would read it. Carefully. With intention. I started with the oldest extracts, the ones I always considered too predictable to require care. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Known values, routine expenses. But it was enough to look more calmly to notice small changes in the pattern. Discrete transfers, made on specific days, always close to each other. My heart raced when I noticed that some decisions had been made in periods when I didn't even remember talking to the bank. I remembered trips, medical appointments, weeks when I barely left the house. Even so, there were clear, precise, irrefutable authorizations in my name on paper. I got up and went to the computer. I opened old emails, using keywords I had never thought to look up before. My name. You name it. Financial terms. The messages appeared on the screen like pieces of a cruel puzzle. Communications sent, answers given, decisions confirmed, all without me being really aware of it. The most disturbing thing was not finding the emails, but noticing the tone. They were written as if I were fully involved, participative, sure of the choices. That wasn't my voice. Not like that. Still, I was the one who signed. I felt a weight in my chest, a mixture of shame and indignation. Shame for having trusted so much. Indignation for having used this trust as a tool. It was no longer just a vague suspicion. It was a pattern. A sequence of thought-out, organized, repeated acts. I closed the computer carefully, as if a sudden movement could break something inside me. I walked around the house slowly, touching the furniture, the walls, trying to anchor myself in the present. I needed to remember who I was before they started deciding for me. For the first time, I admitted out loud, even if only to myself, it wasn't helping. It was control. And control disguised as care is one of the quietest forms of betrayal. I sat down at the table again and took a deep breath. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I had something that I lacked before, clarity. And with it came a distrust that could no longer be ignored, no matter how painful it was. At that moment, I understood that it was not enough to find out what they had done. I needed to understand why. And, above all, how far they were willing to go thinking that I would never notice. In the days that followed, silence ceased to be just the absence of words and began to occupy space within me. It was as if he had waited, as if he sat at the table with me, accompanied me through the corridors of the house and lay next to me at night. Everything seemed normal on the outside, but inside something was on constant alert, too attentive to rest. My son started calling more often than usual. They were not long calls, nor deep conversations. They were checks. Quick questions, too careful, asked with a voice trained to sound calm. If I was fine. If he needed something. If he had slept properly. Each question came loaded with an intention that he pretended not to have. I answered politely, but without offering details. I quickly learned that any more information could be used as justification, as proof that I needed help. So I started measuring words, something I never thought I would have to do with my own son. That tired me more than any open discussion. In one of these calls, I mentioned the bank almost reflexively. It was not an accusation, nor a confrontation. I only mentioned the name, as if commenting on the weather. The silence that came after was short, but revealing. A dense, heavy silence, followed by a sudden change of subject. He began to speak too fast, as if he wanted to cover something that had just escaped. I hung up with the uncomfortable certainty that it wasn't me who was hiding something. He knew exactly what I was talking about. I always knew. And that silence confirmed what no explanation had been able to deny. There was no mistake. There was intention. I began to observe our interactions with almost cold attention. Every pause, every overly calm sentence, every attempt to reassure me without me having asked. It was like watching someone act out carefully while holding something on their back. The peace was poorly disguised, and I no longer had the strength to pretend I didn't see it. The hardest thing was to contain the urge to confront. There were moments when the words rose to their throats, ready to leave. But something in me asked for time. Not to spare him, but to strengthen myself. For the first time, I understood that I didn't need to react immediately to be respected. At night, the silence was even louder. Lying in bed, she relived every conversation, every intonation, every hesitation. I wondered when our relationship had reached that point, when care became control, when trust became permission to decide for me. I also thought about the times I kept quiet in the past. How many times have I swallowed discomfort to avoid conflicts? How many times have I accepted explanations that are too simple not to seem ungrateful? Perhaps that was the accumulation of all these silences, now taking their toll. I understood, with painful clarity, that silence was no longer protecting me. On the contrary, he was just postponing the inevitable. The truth had already settled among us, even without being told. And the more time passed, the heavier it would become. That night, I accepted something that scared and strengthened me at the same time. The confrontation would come. Not because I wanted to fight, but because I needed to exist again within that relationship. And this time, I wouldn't allow silence to speak for me. The next morning, I woke up with an uncomfortable clarity. There was no more room for doubt. Everything I had been discovering pointed in the same direction. While I believed I was only being spared worries, my life was being organized by other hands. Not in a chaotic way, but in a planned, efficient, too silent way to be innocent. I returned to the documents with another look. He was no longer looking for mistakes, but decisions. And they were all there. Long-term investments, changes in beneficiaries, choices made as if thinking about someone's future, but not mine. It was as if I had been transformed into an intermediate stage, a name necessary to legitimize plans that did not belong to me. What shocked me the most was realizing that many of these decisions had no direct bearing on my immediate well-being. They were projections, strategies, arrangements thought out for later. For when I was no longer here, or for when I no longer had a voice. That was not taken care of. It was anticipation of my absence. I remembered the conversations in which they asked me, almost jokingly, if I had already thought about the future. I answered yes, that everything was organized. Maybe they heard it as an invitation. Or maybe they never took me seriously enough to believe that I was capable of deciding to the end. I felt a deep sadness, the kind that is not accompanied by immediate tears. It was the pain of realizing that my opinion had become irrelevant within the family itself. That my presence was tolerated, but my autonomy was not. I thought about how many women my age go through something similar. Not necessarily with money, but with choices. Where to live, how to live, when to stop. Decisions always made, for their own good, almost never with them. That crossed me in a way too personal to ignore. The feeling was of having been slowly pushed out of her own life, without realizing it. Every little concession, every "let me work it out," every silence accepted had made room for others to take over. Not out of explicit malice, but out of convenience. The cruelest thing was knowing that, for them, it probably made sense. They believed they were doing the right thing. And maybe they were, to themselves. The problem is that no one asked me what was right for me. I closed the document folder carefully. I didn't feel angry at that moment. I felt something firmer, determination. I didn't need to recover everything at once. But he needed to regain something essential, the right to decide, even if it caused discomfort. At that moment, I understood that the biggest loss had not been financial. It had been symbolic. They took away from me the authorship of my own story. And I was no longer willing to accept a secondary role in the life that was still mine. I spent that whole day with the feeling of being divided into two parts. One of them was still a mother, loaded with memories, affection, and an almost automatic desire to protect. The other began to understand that love should not demand the disappearance of who I am. This division tired me more than any open confrontation could. While organizing the house, I realized how much my routine has always been marked by concessions. Adjusted schedules, postponed plans, revised decisions to make life easier for others. I always thought that this was part of love. Now I wondered at what point to love came to mean giving up one's dignity. I received a message from him in the middle of the afternoon, asking if I needed help with the things at the bank. The way he wrote it, in invisible quotation marks, made me cringe. It was not an offer. It was an attempt to maintain control, to reaffirm the role he had already assumed without consulting me. I spent long minutes staring at the screen before answering. I thought about everything I could say, all the accusations that were ready to come out. But I only replied that I was solving it myself. The simplicity of the sentence gave me a strange sense of power. Even so, the blame came soon after. The old, known guilt, the one that always came up when I tried to set limits. Part of me whispered that I was being harsh, ungrateful, exaggerated. Another, more silent part reminded us that dignity is not cruelty. I sat on the couch and closed my eyes, trying to organize the whirlwind of thoughts. I remembered the boy he was, the times when I needed to be strong for both of us. I never imagined that one day I would have to be strong against him. This realization hurt in a new, almost unbearable way. At the same time, something inside me began to take hold. It wasn't anger. It was a limit. An invisible line being drawn carefully, but decisively. I could love my son and still not allow him to decide for me. I understood that the real conflict was not between the two of us, but within me. Between continuing to occupy the comfortable role of the mother who gives in and assuming the discomfort of being a woman who imposes herself. The choice was not simple, nor painless. That night, I looked at myself again in the mirror. I saw the same tired woman, scarred by time, but now there was something different in her eyes. A discreet firmness, almost timid, but real. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I just had to not abandon myself. It was there that I made a silent promise to myself. I would not destroy bonds on impulse, but I would also no longer sacrifice my dignity in the name of a love that only existed as long as I kept silent. From that moment on, any step I took would be conscious. Even if it hurt. On the morning everything was confirmed, I no longer expected surprises. Still, when the phone rang, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, as if my body recognized what my mind was still trying to organize. I answered calmly, but with the attention of someone who knows that each word can carry a definitive weight. The attendant identified herself and explained that she was returning a previous request. He said he had separated the documents I requested, including records of authorizations, recordings, and dates. As she spoke, I sat down at the table, arranged the papers in front of me, and took a deep breath, trying to keep track of my own breathing. When I heard the recording, there was no immediate shock. There was recognition. The voice was his, clear, confident, explaining decisions as if they were natural, necessary. At no time did he hesitate, nor did he mention that it should be discussed with me. He spoke on my behalf with frightening ease, as if I were a technicality. The most painful thing was not realizing that he made decisions. It was to hear the conviction with which he justified them. He said he was thinking about the future, about avoiding problems, about saving me. None of these words included the possibility of asking me what I wanted. That was no carelessness. It was a conscious choice. The attendant asked if I had any more questions. I said no. Because, at that moment, there was no more room for uncertainty. Everything was too clear. Every suspicion I had been nurturing had found its proof. I hung up the phone with shaky hands, but with a surprisingly calm mind. The confirmation brought pain, yes, but it also ended a silent wait. There was nothing more to investigate. The time for doubt was over. I sat for a few minutes, looking at the window. The day was normal outside. People passed by, cars came and went. The world had not stopped, even though something fundamental had just collapsed inside me. I thought about how I would tell anyone, if at all. I thought about the possible reactions, the advice that would come. But I realized that that decision didn't need to be shared immediately. It was mine. For the first time in a long time, something was uniquely mine. The confirmation did not bring relief, but it did bring firmness. There was no longer any way to pretend, minimize, or justify. What was done could not be undone with excuses. And I knew, with painful clarity, that nothing between us would ever be the same again. At that moment, I understood that the hardest part would not be the confrontation itself. It would be accepting that the person I trusted to protect me was the same one who decided to erase me. And that wound, I knew, would not heal quickly. I didn't plan the confrontation in advance. I didn't write what I was going to say, I didn't rehearse answers. I just called. My voice came out too firm for someone who still felt his chest tight. I asked him to come to my house. I didn't explain why. He accepted it too quickly, as if he already knew that moment would come. When he entered, I noticed the excessive care in his gestures. The contained smile, the attentive look, almost assessing my emotional state. That irritated me more than any explicit lie. I sat down at the table and indicated the chair in front of me. For the first time, I didn't offer coffee. I started talking about the bank. That's all. I watched his face change subtly, the stiffness in his shoulders, his breathing getting shorter. He tried to interrupt, to say that everything was under control, that I didn't need to worry. I raised my hand and asked him to let me finish. He obeyed, surprised. I placed the documents on the table, one by one. The authorizations, the dates, the recordings. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. Each role did the work for me. He said I had heard everything. That I knew. That there was no more room for vague explanations. He began to justify. He spoke of protection, practicality, avoiding future problems. He used beautiful, well-chosen words. He said that I was exaggerating, that it was not betrayal. As he spoke, I noticed something definitive. At no time did he apologize. I asked why he never asked me what I wanted. There was silence. An uncomfortable, heavy, revealing silence. He looked away, muttered something about thinking it was better this way. That simple sentence confirmed everything I needed to hear. I told him that the problem was not the money. It was disrespect. It was to have been treated as someone incapable of existing without permission. For the first time, I said it out loud, and I felt no fear. I felt sadness. A deep but clean sadness. He tried to get closer, touch my hand. I pushed it away. Not out of anger, but out of limit. He said that love does not authorize anyone to erase the other. That care is not control. That he had crossed a line that could not be ignored. The confrontation did not end with shouting, nor with reconciliation. It ended with a quiet understanding that something had been broken. When he left, the house seemed bigger, emptier. But strangely, I felt more whole. I sat alone for a long time after the door closed. It hurt. It still hurts. But that day, I knew that I had done something irreversible and necessary. For the first time in a long time, I had spoken for myself. And that changed everything. This is the hardest part to tell, because by revealing it, I relive losses, silences, and choices that still hurt. Opening this here means exposing a piece of my history that I could have kept to myself. If you have come this far, it is because you understand the weight of truths that do not fit in silence. That's why I ask you to sign up, not as support, but as a gesture so that voices like mine continue to exist, even when telling is expensive. After the door closed, I stood in the same place for some time, as if my body was still adapting to the space left by it. The house was too quiet, but it was not an empty silence. It was dense, definitive, loaded with something that could no longer be unsaid. I knew, with a quiet, painful certainty, that this conversation had changed our relationship forever. In the following days, there were no long messages or insistent attempts to contact them. Only brief, practical, almost formal communications. It was as if we both knew that any attempt at normalcy would be a lie that would be difficult to sustain. That newfound distance hurt, but it also brought a strange honesty. I realized that the break had not only happened between us. Something inside me had also broken. Not in the sense of destruction, but of rupture with an old version of myself. The woman who always gave in, who explained too much, who accepted to be put aside to avoid conflicts, no longer existed in the same way. There were times when guilt tried to set in. Quick, treacherous thoughts, wondering if I couldn't have handled everything more smoothly. If I wasn't being too harsh. But these thoughts no longer had the strength they had before. I recognized them, took a deep breath and let them pass. What surprised me the most was realizing that he seemed genuinely confused. As if he had never considered the possibility that his actions were a betrayal. That didn't bring me comfort. It brought even greater sadness. Because it meant that, for him, I hadn't really been seen as someone whole. The definitive break did not come with a final fight, nor with harsh words. It came with the silent realization that there was no longer enough trust to pretend closeness. And without trust, any relationship is sustained only by habit, and I no longer wanted to live by habit. I started to organize practical things. Accounts, documents, contacts. Small actions that, together, formed a larger movement, me taking back control of my own life. It was tiring, sometimes lonely, but there was a new coherence in each decision I made. At times, I missed him in an almost physical way. Not the person he showed himself to now, but the idea of the son I believed I had. Dealing with this symbolic loss was one of the hardest parts. Realizing that I was grieving for someone who was still alive. Still, there was no regret. The pain was accompanied by a firm conviction. I could not continue to exist in that relationship the way it was. Staying would have meant disappearing little by little. And that, I knew, would have been an even greater loss. By the end of that week, I understood that the definitive break was not just the end of something. It was the beginning of a phase in which I would have to learn to live with fewer illusions, but with more truth. And, even though it hurt, I chose the truth. I began to deal with the consequences in a practical, almost mechanical way. It was easier that way. I scheduled meetings, organized papers, made calls that I had been postponing for months. Every action required concentration, and I clung to it like one clinging to a board in the midst of churning water. Solving concrete things prevented me from sinking into emotions that still had no name. Returning to the bench was more difficult than I imagined. Not for the service, which was correct and even respectful, but for the feeling of explaining my own life to strangers. Sign documents, reset authorizations, revoke access. Each signature was a silent reminder of how much I had allowed others to take my place. There were times when I felt exhausted. Not physically, but emotionally. As if each decision requires more effort than it should. I thought about how many of these steps could have been avoided if I had been listened to from the beginning. But I refused to turn that into regret. I did what I could with what I knew at that time. The conversations with lawyers and consultants were cold, technical, necessary. At no time did they question my ability. That, in itself, was a painful contrast to the way I had been treated within my own family. Strangers respected me more than those who claimed to love me. At home, the days seemed longer. The silence persisted, but it was no longer the same as it had been at the beginning. There was less tension and more fatigue. A deep tiredness, which came from the constant need to stand firm. Sometimes, I would sit on the couch in the late afternoon and stay there, doing nothing, just breathing. I received a message from him asking if everything was resolved. I read and reread it before answering. He only said that he was taking care of things. There was no more room for long explanations. I should not justify resuming what has always been mine. The consequences also came in the form of different looks from some people close to them. Subtle comments, unsolicited advice, questions disguised as concern. I learned to listen without absorbing. Not everyone would understand. And that's okay. There were financial losses, yes. Some decisions could not be fully reversed. Accepting this hurt. But I learned to separate loss from failure. I hadn't failed. I had been deceived. And recognizing that was part of rebuilding. In the middle of this process, something unexpected happened. I started to trust myself more. Every little choice made on my own, every decision sustained without asking for approval, strengthened something I had forgotten existed. My autonomy was not new, it was just dormant. The consequences did not come as punishment, but as hard learning. Nothing was resolved quickly or easily. Still, by the end of that period, I knew I had crossed an important line. Even tired, even hurt, I was again in charge of my own life. After the emergency room passed, emptiness appeared. Not dramatically, not immediately. It has settled in little by little, like a house that gets too big when certain presences stop taking up space. The days were more organized, but also quieter. And there were times when this silence weighed more heavily than all the previous conflict. I woke up early, as I always did, but there was no longer the same hurry. The coffee would cool in the cup while I sat at the table, staring out the window without really seeing anything. It wasn't constant sadness. It was an absence that was difficult to define, as if something essential had been removed without leaving visible marks. I missed small things. From the unpretentious calls, the quick visits, even the conversations that used to tire me. The mind has these contradictions. Even when we know that something was bad for us, the lack still hurts. And I had to accept this pain without romanticizing it. There were days when I wondered if I had gone too far. If I couldn't have handled everything differently. These questions came mainly at night, when the house seemed to amplify thoughts that during the day I managed to keep under control. I let them pass, trying not to get lost in them. I also had to face the void of identity. For a long time, I was defined by the role of an available mother, of a woman who solved everything for everyone. Now, without that constant function, I needed to figure out who I was when no one needed me like that. I started to fill the time with small things. Longer walks, books put aside for years, tasks done without haste. It was not an attempt to occupy the void, but to live with it. I learned that not every space needs to be filled immediately. Some people moved away naturally, maybe out of discomfort, maybe because they didn't know how to deal with me outside of the role I've always played. Others approached, curiously attracted by this new, quieter, less available version. I watched everything cautiously. The emptiness also brought memories. Good and bad. Moments when I was proud of the choices I made and others when I recognized how much I annulled myself to maintain harmony. Revisiting these memories was painful, but necessary. I needed to understand my own path. I didn't cry every day. I didn't even feel strong the whole time. There were moments of fragility, of doubt, of extreme fatigue. And for the first time, I allowed those feelings to exist without trying to correct them. Gradually, I began to realize that emptiness was not just loss. It was space. An uncomfortable space, yes, but also open to something new. I still didn't know exactly what. I just knew that, despite the loneliness, I was no longer cheating on myself so as not to be alone. The reconstruction did not begin with major decisions or visible changes. It came in small, almost imperceptible gestures, which gradually added up. I started by choosing simple things: what to do with the time, when to leave, when to stay. For the first time in a long time, these choices did not need to be explained or justified to anyone. I started to organize the house in a different way. Not out of necessity, but out of will. I took objects that were there more out of habit than affection. I kept memories that still hurt too much to be seen. Each adjustment was a silent way of affirming that that space was mine again. I also had to learn to ask for help without giving up control. It was a difficult exercise. For years, asking for help meant giving up autonomy. Now, I was testing a new balance, accepting support without disappearing. Some people understood. Others do not. I learned to respect this difference without blaming myself. Financially, things still required constant attention. There were decisions to be made, limits to be imposed, losses to be accepted. None of this was easy, but there was something new in me: confidence. Not the naive confidence of before, but a confidence built on experience, error, and lucidity. I went back to doing things that I had abandoned without realizing it. Walking aimlessly, listening to music too loud, cooking only for me. Small pleasures that once seemed superfluous now took on another meaning. They were not distractions. They were affirmations of presence. On some days, sadness still appeared without warning. All it took was a memory, a date, a phrase heard by chance. I didn't fight against it anymore. He let it go, knowing that rebuilding does not mean erasing what was lived, but learning to carry it in another way. The relationship with my son remained distant. There was no reconciliation or new clashes. Just a different, more honest silence. It hurt, but I no longer tried to fill that space with excuses or empty hope. Accepting distance was part of rebuilding. I noticed that people started to look at me differently. Not with pity, nor with condescension. It was a curious, attentive look. Maybe because I was different myself. Less available, more whole. Less anxious for approval. There was a specific, simple moment when I realized that something had really changed. I was sitting alone, drinking coffee, without haste, without guilt, without feeling that I owed anyone anything. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace in that silence. The reconstruction was not noisy, nor visible to everyone. It was internal, slow, and full of imperfections. But it was real. And even with no guarantees about the future, I knew I was finally living in a way that no longer betrayed me. Time passed without announcing major changes. There was not a specific day when everything seemed resolved, nor a clear turning point. Life just went on, slower, quieter, but also more honest. I learned that not every reconstruction comes with immediate relief. Some arrive with a discreet, almost timid peace. The relationship with my son remained distant, brief, respectful, depthless conversations. It was not the outcome I would have chosen years ago, but it was the only possible one now. I understood that loving someone does not mean accepting anything, and that certain bonds only survive when both recognize limits. There were good days. Days when I walked without thinking about anything, when I laughed alone at old memories, when I felt proud to have stood firm. There were also difficult days, when loneliness tightened and doubt tried to return. I learned to accept both as part of the same path. Financially, my life has not gone back to exactly the way it had been. Some losses remained. Some decisions could not be undone. Still, I started to see money in a different way. Not as a symbol of absolute safety, but as a tool. What really mattered was to have regained the right to choose. I started to trust less in promises and more in attitudes. Less in beautiful words, more in clear limits. This change did not make me bitter, as I had feared. On the contrary, it made me more attentive, more present, more honest with myself. Sometimes I think about the woman I was before that call. I see in her someone who did the best she could with what she knew. I don't judge her. I have affection for that version of me, even though I know that it could no longer exist in the same way. The ending was not a happy one in the traditional sense. There was no complete reconciliation, no sense of victory. But there was something more true: acceptance. Acceptance of losses, changes, what cannot be fixed. Today, my life is smaller in some ways, but more solid in others. There is less noise, less automatic concessions, less fear of displeasing. In return, there is more conscious silence, more self-choices, more respect for myself. If someone asked me what that call changed, I would say that it changed everything, not because it destroyed my life, but because it gave me back the authorship of it. And even if the price was high, I know I wouldn't go back. Because, in the end, living without betraying yourself is the most honest way to move forward. If this story touched something in you, share this video. It's not just about what I've lived through, it's about patterns that silence, control, and make a lot of people doubt their own voice. Send it to someone who needs to hear this today, because sharing is also an act of solidarity, and sometimes the first step in breaking an old silence. I'll stay here reading every comment. What city and country are you watching from, and what about this story has stayed with you? Your words matter more than you realize, they actually get to me.